Do. Hello, everybody. How are you? It is 11:59. My name is Justin Rivers, Chief Experience Officer. Come on in. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. I just wanted to introduce Nicole, who some of you already know Nicole very well. Nicole, coming live from St. Louis, is my backup today in case anything goes wrong technically. She is here just to assure you that everything will be fine. Yes. And assure me too. Everybody who knows the drill coming in right now is already saying hello, but let's do formal introductions for some of you who may not know the drill. But it's not 12 yet, so I'm going to wait till 12 exactly. We like to start on time. Thank you all for joining us today. And it is 12 now. So today is the beginning of our new series called Lost New York. And we're starting with one of the greatest lost structures in New York, the Crystal Palace. You will be led today by me, Justin Rivers, again, Chief Experience Officer for Untapped New York, here with Nicole, who will be monitoring the chat, putting up links, and also, again, here is technical backup. As always, please feel free to chat and comment here in the chat with each other. If you have questions, it makes it easier for Nicole and I if you put them in the question function, but we'll also be going through this function as well for Q&A at the end. Also, if you have any audio or visual issues with the presentation with Livestorm, it's best just to refresh your page. Also, something I always neglect to say, Livestorm works really well with Chrome. Sometimes it's a little more finicky with Safari if you are using Safari. So just something to note. And as always, I am very appreciative of all of our great insiders who are joining us today. They are subscribers. And if you are not, you too can be a subscriber for as little as $10 a month. And you can try us out for a month free if you use the code Join Us when you subscribe. And I put that link, the chat. But so many of you already know what to do, which is to say hello and tell us where you are from. Always good to see you, Cynthia from Baltimore, Lorraine from Asheville, Klaus from New York. Hi, Klaus. Christopher from Staten Island, Pete from San Francisco, Joe from London. We're going to be talking about London, Joe, in the beginning of this presentation. Martha from Hanover, New Hampshire. One of the big figures I'll be talking about is a New Hampshire boy, Horace Greeley. And everybody else, Janet, hello. Richard from sunny Hollywood. Nancy, hi from New Jersey, my home state. Robin up in the Berkshires. Hazel. Oh, another some from Team GB, Great Britain. Hazel, thank you. From Shropshire. Morbo from Delaware County, PA. And so many. Greetings, greetings, greetings. Welcome. I am going to get started, so continue to say hello. Nicole will be monitoring the chat if you need anything. And again, just in case there is a technical issue. But let's get started. So one of the things I'm going to begin with is a couple of pre-flight prefaces before I get into our topic today, one of which is Lost New York is going to be a continuing series of lost structures throughout New York history. We do have quite a few already pre-planned, but if you have any suggestions, please feel free to email them to me at justin@untappedcities.com. Some of you already have, so, which I always know is a good sign. That means you're interested. And of course, this comes born out of my love for Penn Station, which was the ultimate Lost New York building. Penn Station will not make it to Lost New York. I've talked about it so many times. I think it's best to leave it where it is. But also, one of the things for those of you who do not know me very well or have attended any of my tours or presentations, I think the Crystal Palace is a really good place to say that, especially because this topic is very well documented in New York history. As a matter of fact, this is really the beginning of really very quite detailed documentation of the history of New York by some of the best journalists New York has ever known. And I just like to say, I'm not a historian by training. I am a storyteller, I'm a teacher, and I am a journalist. So what we talk about and how I frame a lot of the context of these presentations are through those lenses. Historians painstakingly research for months, sometimes years on their topics. And because of my deadlines, I don't. So I stand on a lot of giant shoulders when I talk about the Crystal Palace today. But I have been reading about the Crystal Palace for years and have used quite a few primary sources from the 1850s here. Okay, enough. Hi, everybody. Let's get started. And there's our title slide. We are going to see a couple of these very, I'm almost going to say stock images of the Crystal Palace. But let's first talk. Oh, the other thing I wanted to say was different from some of the other presentations that I've given in the past. Because I think there's such a great story to be told, I am sort of framing this sort of time traveling tour in chapters. So kind of like a book. So chapter 1, the Muse. So many of you might know that there was a Crystal Palace before the New York Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, London. It was built in 1851 for the Great Exposition, which was really sort of the birth of these ideas of world expositions, which will become what we know today as World's Fairs. And the building in Hyde Park, which ended up getting moved, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides, was designed by this gentleman, Joseph Paxton. And Joseph Paxton started his career as a simple English gardener. He sort of is an architect almost by hobby, but a lot of his architecture involves gardening. So think more like greenhouses, which obviously lend themselves very nicely to what he builds. But because of the Crystal Palace, he sort of gets skyrocketed to fame. He becomes an MP. Also, fascinatingly enough, he is known for cultivating the Cavendish banana, which is the most consumed banana in the Western world. But one of his enduring legacies, besides people eating bananas, is this building, which is the Crystal Palace in Hyde Park, which, as you can see by the title of this very lovely sketch here, was built for the Great Exposition of 1851, which was a Victoria and Albert headed exposition to demonstrate the wealth and industry of Great Britain by inviting a lot of the countries that sort of sat under the British flag at the time, but also inviting other countries like America, which was a great ally to the Brits at that time, to come and display their great art and their great machinery and industry of the time. So the hall that housed them was Paxton's Crystal Palace. It was cast iron and plate glass. And this is really the first time in the world that you have a building built almost entirely of cast iron and plate glass. And it was something that the world had never seen on such a scale before. It was 1,851 feet. It was the height of 128 feet, and the height's going to become important because New York's Crystal Palace will beat it by 20 feet. The architecture was symbolic of some of the great buildings that would come from almost this prefab way of building structures. This is not the way structures were built. You have, to date, cathedrals, large government houses being built over the course of years, sometimes decades, that are taking a very long time because of cumbersome masonry work. These glass cast iron buildings go up in months, and they're obviously quite impressive. Now, this was the layout of the original Crystal Palace, very, very long. And this was the impressive nature of this building, was that it covered so much acreage of Hyde Park, which is, again, not going to be, when we talk about the sister New York Crystal Palace, it's not going to be the footprint, it's going to be the height. And this was a painting of the Hyde Park Crystal Palace during the 1851 exposition, as you could see, laid out on 2 floors. And each of these stalls were divided by country and goods. And there was medals for some of the best representations of technology there. And just overwrought and packed with materials. I believe the number was 1,400 or 4,400 expositioners had come. Over 30 countries were represented there, including the United States. The really interesting and cool thing about the Hyde Park Crystal Palace was they literally built it around trees in Hyde Park, as you can see here at one of the ends. I forgot which end, if this is the western end or not. They had to build it around the trees that were already in the park. And there's a photograph after the exposition had cleaned out of a tree in the hall. Now, one of the interesting things about this structure is after the exposition, it will actually be taken down and moved. It will not be destroyed intentionally. It is moved to South London, right near Sandringham Hill, which was an affluent suburb, mainly at the time with large villas. And in June of 1854, again, it was moved. It will survive until 1936, which is why there are so many pictures of it documented. And this is a later picture of it when it's moved to, I think it's Sydenham Hill. I think I said that wrong. All of my English participants can correct me. Now, I'm going to be telling sort of the story of the Crystal Palace through the eyes of this gentleman, one of the famous neckbeards New York ever produced, Horace Greeley. I love Horace Greeley. He's one of my favorite New York characters besides P.T. Barnum at this time. Horace Greeley is one of the best journalists that came out of this era. He's the founder and chief editor and publisher of the New York Tribune, which later in its life will become the Herald Tribune. And Horace Greeley is a New Englander. He's born in New Hampshire and comes to New York to make his way in journalism. And boy, does he make his way. And for the Tribune, he travels over to London to visit the exposition. And he decides basically that this is a really awesome thing that the English have done. Great Britain has shown its might in industry, and it's time that America do the same. And actually, his quote was, before he left London to come back to New York, and this is just a picture of one of the inaugural 1841 Tribunes, I think a strictly American fair, quote, by the way, I think a strictly American fair might be got up, which would evince more originality of creation or design, saying that an American fair will be more creative and more original than a British fair, and it's time we do it. So then he sails home a couple months later, and using the Tribune as a mouthpiece, he not only says America needs to do a fair, he says, New York needs to host this fair. I do hope we may have a Crystal Palace of like proportions in New York within 2 years. It would be of inestimable worth as a study to our young architects, builders, and artisans. Basically saying New York has to host this. This will be great for the city, and it will be an enduring legacy for anybody in the sciences or architecture. And he was right. Horace Greeley, with these very New England sensibilities that he brings to New York, he wants to open up art and technology and industry to everybody, not just the rich. Which takes us to Chapter 2, Welcome to New York, 1853. I don't know if any of you are Taylor Swift fans. Nicole, this is the illusion that I was making before. Taylor Swift, who became New York's ambassador a couple of years ago, which actually shook a couple heads because she's not a New Yorker, wrote a song called Welcome to New York. And actually, in 1853, New York had a Taylor Swift of its own in Jenny Lind, who was a Swedish opera singer who did 93 sold-out concerts in New York. She became a superstar. But before we talk about the palace, I really want to talk about what New York was like in 1853. It's a little bit different than the New York we know today. And also realize that this is the beginning of the New York tourist industry. Literally, this is the year that the New York tourist industry begins. So it's almost going to be a little bit like a guidebook. So this is a map of New York in 1853, as you can see. And literally the right edge of this map is pretty much where urban development of New York starts tapering off into country, which if you can't see it, I'm going to blow it up in the next slide. The Crystal Palace and Reservoir Square are literally the northern edge of developed New York at this time. I know that some of you are extremely detail-oriented, especially when I show maps on some of these presentations. So I know somebody might ask, what are the numbers? The numbers are not actually neighborhood. The red numbers on this map were fire alarm designations. So there were fire observation towers all throughout Manhattan. We still have one today in Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem. And they'd have bells on them. And if you rung a bell 8 times, it meant the lower west side of Manhattan. That's where the fire was. That's where you went, just so you know. So here's the blow up. And as you can see here, between 6th and 5th Avenue at 41st, between 40th and 42nd Street, is the reservoir, which we'll talk more about in a minute, the Croton Reservoir tank or holding area, and the Crystal Palace, which was built on what was called Reservoir Square on the west side of the structure. And again, as you can see by the shading, shading indicates development, no shading indicates open lot. And there's a lot of open lots on the north side of the reservoir. As those of you who know Grand Central history very well, you'll probably recognize that even in the 1860s, almost 10 to 15 years after this point, when Vanderbilt is forced up to 42nd in Lexington, he says, "Are you kidding me? That's the Boondocks." And that's what it's really known as at the time. Now, in preparation for the World's Fair coming, which it wasn't called a World's Fair, we'll talk about the title in a little bit, but it's known as a World's Fair later on, there was a guidebook. So people started saying, hey, we could start capitalizing on people coming to New York. Before this time, New York is really a port city. Its importance is defined by its location on waterways, bringing goods in and out of the country. It's not defined as a place where people come to visit, to stay. If you're traveling through New York, most likely you're going north or you're going out to the Midwest, or south if you're coming from New England. You're not really staying in New York. Now we see this opportunity to make New York a marvel. So I'm taking literally a couple of pages out of the Stranger's Handbook for the City of New York, what to see and how to see it. And you can see the Croton Reservoir is front and center on the cover page. Now I'm going to start south and move north. So one of the hottest spots in New York at the time was Castle Garden, which was made from the fortification of Castle Clinton. And we, again, know it today as Castle Clinton. Now you go there to get your ferries to Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty. But back in the day, you went there to arrive in New York. You could also grab a beer there. There was a beer garden. And there was a very, very large auditorium-like stage. And that's where Jenny Lind did a bunch of her performances at Castle Garden. And that's really what it gets known for. In 1835, Samuel Morse publicly demonstrated the use of his telegraph to a sold-out crowd, by the way. And the American Institute, which is sort of the New York version of the National Exposition of Industry of all nations, which will happen at the Crystal Palace, uses Castle Clinton to do their yearly expositions down there. And we'll talk about the difference in a little bit. And this is the auditorium. Castle Williams was designed, not Castle Williams, I'm sorry, that's on Governor's Island. Castle Clinton was designed to protect the harbor in case of British invasion during the War of 1812. They never fired a shot in anger, still to this day, and hopefully never will. I don't think it's designed to anymore. And there's Jenny Lind performing, actually on stage in the white gown. So there's Battery Park, which you had to access Castle Garden by a palisade out to the water. It was not surrounded by the park yet. As you can see, the park is not really that much of a park at the moment. It's expanding. There's park space inside, but it's sort of just creeping on out. And this is actually a daguerreotype taken, this, I believe it's in the early 1850s. I'm not exactly sure of the date, by French artist Victor Prévost. Victor Prévost was a French artist born in France who studied early photographic technology and came to New York hoping to make a lot of money on it. Now, there were a lot of photographers showing off their daguerreotypes, hoping to get people to sit for their portraits and make a lot of money off of them. Unfortunately, Prévost was not one of them. He did not do very well by selling his photographs, even though he was one of the first to really take photographs of New York. He ended up becoming a New York City school teacher, and he taught art and physics in various schools throughout the city. Moving up north, the guidebook says you have to stop at Bowling Green Park, or one of New York's many beautiful parks. And this was a photo of Bowling Green from 1850. As some of you know who've joined me for Dutch New Amsterdam or Secrets of the Financial District, as you see that fence is still there today around the park. It was New York's first park. It still is New York's first park, made a municipal park in 1733. There are 17 other parks in the city at the time, including Tompkins Square Park, City Hall Park, Battery Park behind us, Madison Square, which is a fairly new park. What park is missing? Central. Central is not yet, it's only a glimmer in Olmsted's eye at this point, but it's coming soon. Go up to Broadway. Right before you hit St. Paul's by City Hall Park, you have Brady's daguerreotype gallery. So Matthew Brady is really sort of the big superstar name that you come to think of for early photographs, mainly because Abraham Lincoln sat for him, and that really skyrocketed him to success. But even before then, his portrait gallery and studio was quite a big name, and that's mainly because of his association with the Tribune and Greeley. He had a gallery you could go in, you could browse photographs that had already been taken. You could also purchase them. You could buy miniatures, which were a little bit more reasonable than just full portraits. Those were more designed to be for the rich. And hopefully he was hoping you'd buy them. And he, basically the whole idea was these are more detailed, more crisp than a painted portrait, and obviously the most modern technology of the day. Brady, by the way, will go ahead and have a booth at the exhibition, and he will win, I believe he wins the silver medal in his category or class, which we'll talk about in a minute. And here is a photograph of the founding board, or sort of the founding staff of the New York Tribune in 1841. And it is Brady sitting next to a young Horace Greeley, dead center, sitting down. And there they are, a bunch of young bearded dudes with glasses, some of them, only one of them, much like New York today. But this is really quite an iconic shot. Moving right across the street to the corner of Broadway and Ann Street, and I know, again, I've talked about this on the Secrets of the Financial District tour. This was probably one of the most peopled attractions in New York at the time, and it was Barnum's American Museum. And at the height of the museum's life, between 1841 and 1865, 38 million customers will pay 25 cents to get into this building. At the time that the building burns in the 1860s, there's only 32 million people in the country. So this was a huge, huge spot for people to come to. Even if you weren't staying in New York, you would make your way there if you were there for a day or 2 days. There was a performance space, a stage in there. There was an aquarium with a whale in it. And of course, Barnum was a huckster. So Barnum created all of these big shows for you to come see, or he also created these smaller exhibitions like the Fiji Mermaid, which you'll see in a minute. I love this painting of the corner of Ann Street, which is now a Zara's, by the way. And there it is, the Fiji Mermaid. You can see by this ad, Egyptian mummies, family of Peruvian mummies. All of these things were fake, by the way. It was just real live good theater that he was putting on to get people to come into the museum. But what wasn't fake was he did have a whale. He had a beluga whale in a very large tank, which he actually devised a system to get water from the, I believe it was from the Hudson. I don't think it was from the East River, although the East River would have been closer, to keep the whale happy in its tank, although it wasn't because the tank was too small. And unfortunately, when the building burns in 1865, the whale will be boiled to death. So sad. Now, 2 hotels were built for the coming of the World's Fair in the Crystal Palace. The first was the St. Nicholas Hotel. Now, these were very large hotels. The Astors were really the only game in town at this point, but it was very, very affluent money who could stay at the Astor Hotel. The St. Nicholas, which is being pictured here, which was on Broadway and Broome Street, was more of a middle-class establishment, could accommodate about 800 guests at the time, but it did elaborately furnish rooms and suites for those who might want to pay a little more, and it advertised central heating that brought heat right into your building. Although for most of the World's Fair, you probably didn't want the heating in the building because it was during the summer. The other hotel was the Metropolitan Hotel, both of which we've lost to time. So this was just north of the St. Nicholas, and it occupied a whole block from Broadway between Crosby and Prince Streets. And this was a brownstone hotel, much more luxurious, had far less rooms, and it only about 100 rooms. So you could tell these suites were really for the affluent who were coming to visit for the fair. One of the most popular entertainment spots / restaurants was Niblo's Garden. For those of you who are Hello Dolly fans, you can think sort of the Harmonia Gardens of New York at the time. This is where the elite came to have dinner. They came to see a show. As a matter of fact, and this was on the corner of Broadway and Prince Street, by the way. Very impressive entertainment complex. They would do sort of a bizarre mix of all types of things. You had an eatery, you had an outdoor garden you could sit in. And when they opened the fair in 1854, they actually did not have the ceremony or the reception in the Crystal Palace itself because it wasn't rigged for enough light at the time. They had it at Niblo's. So President Franklin Pierce, who came to open the fair, and all of the fair bigwigs came here to celebrate the opening. And here's a picture of Niblo's Opera House. Obviously, a very, very ornate, gorgeous, gorgeous setup. Now, one of the buildings I would like to cover at some point in a further Lost New York installment is the Hippodrome. And there were two hippodromes. This was the first. There's, of course, the more modern Hippodrome in Midtown area. But this Hippodrome at the time was located right off of Madison Square. And it was an elliptical tent, as you can see, with sort of a Castelline building around it. And inside was a whole tent structure. It could hold 10,000 people, kind of Roman in the way that it looked. It was a very, very lofty tent space, and I believe those the tent had a look of green and white stripes. It almost looks like a peppermint stick. And this was definitely a hot spot to come to see like horse shows. They did a lot of horse tricks, animal acts, and they did do chariot races there. Now, one of the things that the incoming World's Fair / or exhibition, I keep calling it a World's Fair, technically it was both, will bring our people and tourism. And this is a new thing for New York in 1853. So they start building what they call grog shops, dance halls. You'll see this is a dance hall at the Wickedest Man's House. And these were places for common New Yorkers to come and blow off some steam after work, but also for visitors to come, have a meal, have some drinks, as you can see here, listen to music, and of course, dance. That was the most popular evening pastime at that time. And these places start opening up almost en masse around Reservoir Square, which again was a ghost town. It was a shanty town. So this was a whole new neighborhood popping up to service the World's Fair. And it's the beginning of New York tourism as we know it. You're going to start getting everything Crystal Palace themed, Crystal Palace handkerchiefs, Crystal Palace glasses. I'm going to show you a souvenir Crystal Palace glass bottle from the Latting Observatory in a couple of slides. They are really trying to sell to the masses who are coming to visit New York now. And of course, I'm a big transportation buff. And if you did not want to spend what was quite a bit of money, I believe it was about 12.5 cents for an omnibus, which was sort of like a bus stagecoach carriage to get you up to 6th Avenue and 42nd Street. You could take the train, and the train was drawn by horses. And this was the 6th Avenue train. It was about 3.5 cents. And as you can see, it was packed, bringing people up to the Crystal Palace and to the World's Fair. This was the cheaper way to go. You could, of course, walk, but that was markedly more difficult at this time because the streets were very dirty, very crowded, not as clean, and you always sort of took your life in your hands with stagecoach and carriage traffic. So the best way was get on what they called the railroad, drawn by horses. You could also get into the city via the Harlem Line, which was the way in and out of the north part of Manhattan at the time. Eventually, not soon after, Cornelius Vanderbilt will buy the Harlem Line and incorporate it into his New York Central network. But this is way before Grand Central as we know it. And here you can see on the day of the inauguration of the Crystal Palace, the throngs of people getting off the 6th Avenue train. Again, and they referred to it as a train. And you can see the sign on the top, Crystal Palace Hippodrome. These were the stops that it was making. And you could see, this is from the Illustrated News, and you could see a newsboy trying to sell Illustrated News on the corner. Illustrated News was actually a P.T. Barnum enterprise. He thought the more common people who couldn't read would want to see their news being depicted. And so a lot of the images that we see here on this presentation are from the Illustrated News. So let's get to chapter 3, the Great Building, which is a double meaning, building itself and building the building. Love this photo. This is what the space that Bryant Park will eventually become, the Crystal Palace will eventually become in 1846. So at first in 1686, the colonial governor Thomas Dungan says that the land up in this area is public land and can be used for whatever the public needs it to be. Actually, George Washington will run roughshod over this land to get out of New York after the Battle of Long Island or Battle of Brooklyn. And then eventually in 1822, after Washington Square Park is all filled up with bodies, this will become a potter's field. It will become a potter's field until 1840 when they build the Croton Reservoir. And they basically say it's probably a bad idea to keep burying bodies right by our biggest source of drinking water, which was smart. For those of you joining us tomorrow for, I believe it's tomorrow, Secrets of New York podcast, we will talk about why that's not a good idea and why manholes are invented. A little bit of a plug. But what happens is in 1842, they build this structure, which is the Croton Reservoir. It was designed to hold 20 million gallons of water for the growing island. At the time before this, most New Yorkers got their drinking water from a very polluted source down south by Foley Square known as the Collect Pond. The problem was the Collect Pond was super polluted now because of urbanization, tanneries, also burials. The African American burial site is down there. A lot of people were being buried near the shore of the Collect Pond. Not good. We've got cholera outbreaks all the time in the 1830s, pandemic after pandemic. We think we have it bad now. And they bring on a starchitect of the time to basically create this holding tank where they're taking water from Westchester County, a very clean water source. They're piping it down into New York, and it's being held here by the millions of gallons in the reservoir. It is designed by James Renwick, who will go on to design St. Patrick's Cathedral, Grace Church. He does the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. He also does quite a few structures on Roosevelt Island, including the lighthouse on Roosevelt Island and the smallpox hospital, which is still there today in ruin form. And he does it in this Egyptian revival, which I'm always a big fan of Egyptian revival. For those of you who joined the Williamsburg tour, you know I love that Cass Gilbert building that is now condos. It's just a very, very impressive and sometimes very dominant looking structure. And that's going to be a problem for the Crystal Palace. And also, you know, this is what I love to do. This is what it looked like this is much later after the Crystal Palace is burned. This is what it looks like today. It is the site of the New York Public Library. And there is a remnant wall downstairs of the Croton Reservoir in the library today. Now, these are the two architects who win the design. So what happens is Greeley comes home, a bunch of other journalists and very, very affluent businessmen come back from London and say, yes, New York is going to be the site. And in 2 years' time, we are going to do our version of the Industry of All Nations Fair. But we need to build our own Crystal Palace. They put out basically an RFP to architects at the time to say, come up with something. The only rules were the building needed to be iron and glass. It needed to be another Crystal Palace. So the two architects who teamed up to win that account were Georg Karstensen and Charles Gildemeister, none of which were American, by the way. Carstensen was best known for designing the Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen. And Carstensen would also serve as an officer in the Danish army before he came to New York. He lands in New York in 1850. He teams up with Gildemeister, and they win this very high-profile account very quickly. Unfortunately, he will return home to Copenhagen in sort of disgrace in 1855 because of their sort of reputations were dragged through the mud, which I'll explain in a minute. And he returns home in 1855. He dies 2 years later and never knows that the Crystal Palace burns. Gildemeister will leave New York in 1857, and it is not known if he ever heard that the Crystal Palace burned, but it was such big news that he probably heard about that. But I'm jumping to the end. So they design a really, really elegant solution to the fact that the Croton Reservoir is hemmed in by the 1811 grid plan. So it's put on a very small piece of land. They have roughly 6 acres to work with. Whereas obviously, as you see by the hard park layout, they had the whole entire park that they could use. So Carstensen and Gildemeister say, we've got to build tall. Now, this is the beginning of building tall in New York, pretty much. The idea was we don't have a lot of land on the bottom, so we got to move up. What they design is a Greek cross, roughly the base is about 2.5 stories tall. And then they put the largest dome in America on top of it. And that dome will help to surpass the height of the reservoir behind it. They were basically complaining that how could you put this thing right behind one of the most imposing structures in New York, like Renwick's Reservoir. So they have to design, again, this very, very compact but tall structure in the shape of an octagon and a Greek cross. And they did, I'm just going to say, I think a really elegant job with what they had. This is the design of the dome. The dome structure itself was roughly 100 feet, but when they put it on top of the supporting structure, it becomes 148 feet, which surpasses the Hyde Park Dome by 20 feet, which is important because New York can say, all right, we have the tallest Crystal Palace ever built. And New York will continue to try to say that throughout its history, beginning with the Crystal Palace. So in October of 1852, they get to work. The idea was, this is almost like an erector set. Carstensen and Gildemeister create basically 5 different interlocking cast iron panels that can be locked together, and then plate glass would be inserted to build the building. And this is what you're seeing here, people looking on from the Croton Reservoir as they're beginning to build the base of the Crystal Palace. Now, one of the first things that happens is the Crystal Palace Board, which was a consortium of some of New York's richest men who were basically paying for the building and paying for the fair, did not want to do a lot of the more intricate work that was designed by the architects, including they didn't want to deal with the basement. So they build a very, very, I'm just going to say, crappy version of a basement, which Gildemeister and Carstensen just complain that you now are basically making us shrink down the acreage to a little over 5 acres of coverage, where if we had a basement, we could be a little bit larger. There's also a couple of interlocking details that, again, the board didn't want to pay for. So when construction was taking much longer than expected, who did the board blame? They blamed the architect, so much so that they smeared their reputations. And when the Crystal Palace opened, they weren't even on the dais. They were in the audience and not named. They will get some retribution later at the end of the fair, which I'll tell you a little bit later. Here is now a little bit further on. So they started in October of 1852. So this is probably a couple months later. But notice off to the left side, what's going up. Now, the Latting Observatory, which will be the tallest building, one of the tallest buildings in the world when it's completed, is not part of the fair. It's not part of the exposition, and it was not blessed by the board. It was a private enterprise started by an inventor and a huckster, Warren Latting. But it basically figures out, we're going to get right next to the Crystal Palace and we're going to capitalize on it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. And here is progress as they are completing the dome. And the dome is going to be iron, but there's going to be tin put on the outside of the dome, not glass. And it was, while it was under construction, it really was the interest of observers to see it being built. As a matter of fact, Horace Greeley said, "Workmen perched like autumnal pigeons on leafy boughs, clustered within and without the vast edifice, and the magic web of improvement each day proceeded," talking about the dome. A very, very young newspaper, only a couple years old, by the name of the New York Daily Times, will say, "Scores of men seemingly no larger than mice hung pendant from the lofty and magnificent dome, coating its inner surface with the destined decorations." New York Daily Times. I wonder if it'll survive. And here is a picture, this also by Victor Prevost, who most of our rare surviving pictures of the Crystal Palace come from, of the dome almost finished. As you can see, they're not done applying the tin yet, but guess what's done? The Latting Observatory. That thing went up very, very quickly. Here's another view from 6th Avenue and 41st Street. Which is where I usually get lunch when I am in my foundation office on 41st Street. There's a pret-a-manger right there now. And I do not know who took this photograph. And I don't know if it's a daguerreotype or a cellotype. It looks like it might be a cellotype, but I love it. And this is what that spot looks like today. Almost exactly from the perspective of there. And then it is completed. So what happens is they were supposed to open the fair on May 1st of 1853. But again, because of building issues, mainly because the board decided to cut some of the most important pieces of the erector set from the plans, there were tons of delays, tons of budget cuts, and it was not going to open on May 1st. And this is a big problem because people were coming from all over the world to see the exhibition start on May 1st. So basically the Crystal Palace and the finishing of the Crystal Palace becomes an attraction. Now, what happens is really the palace will not be completely done until August of 1853, but on July 14th of 1853, they're going to open anyway. I think one of the quotes from one of the board members was, "All right, gents, let's have a shave and dress up and open this thing anyway," which again, sometimes is a very New York attitude. And love this picture. So this picture really demonstrates what the area looked like. Look at that little shanty on the corner. Not exactly what we have today on 40th. This is 40th and 6th Avenue. Chapter 4. Now the fair opens. What do you see at the fair? So one of my favorite primary sources was this, the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations, which is a 240 some odd page guidebook to the fair. Not really illustrated. It's all text. It's very dense. It just basically tells you where exactly everybody was and what they were exhibiting. Nicole is going to put a link to an article I wrote about the Crystal Palace about 4 years ago, celebrating the opening of the fair in July of, was it 2014? I don't remember. But there is a link to the full document in that article if you're interested. I could also try to dig it up at the end. But it's very dense. It's not exactly exciting reading, but you can know almost painstakingly where everybody was. Another primary source that I really liked to comb through, of course, because I'm telling the story through his eyes, is Horace Greeley's Art and Industry exhibitions at the Crystal Palace. And this was a much larger, much denser read. It was 419 pages long. But in it, he sort of sets about why he thought this was very important to New York. He basically said that right now, New York, and this was very true in the 1840s and 1850s and into the 1860s and 70s, is going to be a hotbed of protest, of class rivalry. There's going to be a lot of rioting. So you've got the Astor Place riots in the 1840s, which I talk about on the subway tour, which were just a full demonstration of how unhappy immigrant and working classes were in light of the very, very rich industrialist classes who were making money hand over fist. And I really like this is a long quote, but he puts it very well. And I'll break it down a little bit. And this is from Art and Industry. He says, mere wealth without the refinements of wealth, barbaric ostentation, prodigal display, extravagant self-indulgence can only corrupt morals and degrade character. What he's saying is, God, these rich guys who are building these massive estates on Fifth Avenue, and believe me, I'm doing research for Lost New York we're doing in May for the Gilded Age mansions. These guys are making millions of, well, what we would think of as millions of dollars, and they're just building these ostentatious palaces to wealth without really even knowing what a lot of this wealth symbolizes. And Greeley thinks this is awful. But the cultivation of the finer arts redeems society of its grossness, spreads an unconscious moderation and charm around it, softens the asperity of human intercourse, elevates our ideals, and imparts a sense of serene enjoyment to all social relations. Our common people, immeasurably superior to the common people of other nations in easy means of subsistence, in intelligence, as in the sterling virtues, are yet almost as immeasurably behind them in polished and genteel manners, and the love of music, painting, statuary, and all of the more refined social pleasures. Meaning, our common folk have the ability to be leaps and bounds more refined than the rich men of this country, because he wants this exhibition to bring the love of art and to bring the love of culture and industry to everybody. And this is why I really like using him as the mouthpiece. He saw this as the beginning of equality for all of the classes. Very New England of him, but he makes it a very New York ideal. And he's hoping that through this palace and through this exhibition, the most common of people will be able to become fans of artists. And what he was hoping was people would start clamoring for art museums and cultural institutions, which eventually will find their way into New York structure. Now, opening day, July 14th, 1853. This was a scene at the time. This is what it was by the Illustrated News looked like in the center of the Crystal Palace. Franklin Pierce will say, quote, everything around us reminds us that we live in a utilitarian age where science, instead of being locked up for the admiration of the world, has become tributary to the arts, manufactures, agriculture, and all that goes to promote our domestic comfort and our universal prosperity. Same message. Everybody now is open to science and arts and industry because of this fair. Now, lofty ideals and lofty quotes. Let's talk about the actual practicality of being an attendee at this fair. This is sort of the stuff that I absolutely love. So to get in, you entered in through 6th Avenue, right where that main entrance into Bryant Park is by the fountain. And you would form 3 lines. Either a day pass line, and a day pass was 25 cents. And you could, children under 12 were free. Children under 12 were half price. Or you could buy a $10 season ticket and come in whenever you wanted. But of course, everybody was complaining about the prices at the time. But the 3rd line was to get in. And to get in, you had to go through what they called the entrance register, which is a turnstile. And this is the first time people really ever saw turnstiles. And the reason for the turnstile was so that the exhibition crew could could count every person who walked into the building. And they did. 1.1 million people will come in for the first season of the fair. And of course, this is what the scene looked like trying to clamor to get the tickets at the opening of the fair. Absolute bedlam. Talk about not being in a pandemic then, huh? Oh, I'm sorry. It was not 25 cents. It was 50 cents. I was just looking at my notes here. So it was 25 cents for children under 12. And here's what a ticket looked like. This is from the City of the Museum of New York's very fine Crystal Palace collection. And this was from November, which was the last month of the 1853 season. back to the guidebook, once you walked in, you could visit exhibitions divided into 31 different classes. And these 31 different classes had very, very long 19th century names to them, like class number 5 were machines for direct use, including steam, hydraulic, and pneumatic engines, railways, and other carriages. Class number 3 was substances used as food. So in that article that will be linked that I wrote, feel free to peruse the entire exhibition directory. May I suggest stopping off at Class 3, Division A, to sample superior pineapple cheese or Brussels health mustard. Pineapple cheese. Not too sure about that, although I do love both separately. And this was the floor layout that was provided in the guidebook. So you could see basically where the subclasses were basically mapped out by stall, pretty much. The next slide is a more detailed look at the floor plan where you could see where the countries were. So you could see Great Britain and Ireland are in the top right side. And then you've got United States, which occupies the entire top left side. And then a couple of other countries like Austria. You've got a little bit of Canada. You've got German states on either side. And then, of course, there were 2 levels in the octagon. So you walked up 4 sets of stairs around the center dome. Now, you also notice at the top of this slide, and I don't think my cursor works for you guys, but you're going to see ladies' saloon and gents' saloon on either side of the top left and right. And that was a refreshment station for men and women. But you might also take note of on the top sort of diagonal of each of those rooms, there looked like a very thin room with stalls. And those were refreshment stations. And ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the first instances of indoor restrooms, which were provided for the public. This was a very, very, very novel thing to do. Usually it would be outhouses or pits outside, but not for the Crystal Palace, indoor. Now, the one thing I am still trying to figure out, because I cannot find it anywhere, is whether or not they had plumbing or whether they were just simply stalls. I'm hoping they had plumbing because obviously water, they're right next door to the reservoir, water did run to the building. If anybody knows, drop a line. So this was the view that you had once you walked in. Wow. I mean, just again, these are one of those places I just wish I could have 10 minutes to see. And the center statue of the first season was, much like the 1939 World's Fair, George Washington. The only thing is the 39 and 40 World's Fair, they loved the statue of Washington. At this World's Fair, people absolutely hated it. And we'll talk about that in a second. Here's another view. They divided it, by the way, like church. So there was the north nave, the south nave, the west and the east naves, and then 2 levels and a sub-basement. That's pretty much the layout. And here's a view. So the Illustrated News, I believe this was the Illustrated News, did a panoramic 4-panel stretch of what the both top and bottom levels looked like. Some of the things that were exhibited at the fair for the first time that still sort of make their way into our lives today. There were actually 10 sewing machines exhibited at the Crystal Palace, but Isaac Singer's drew the most attention from people, mainly because it made 200 stitches per minute compared to roughly 40 for a fast seamstress. And it had a foot pedal, or what they called a treadle back then. And it did win the silver medal for this category of the fair. And of course, Singer sewing machines will go on in infamy for sewing machines. Samuel Colt was awarded the silver medal in naval architecture, military engineering, armor, and accoutrements for his superior workmanship on his pistols. And he patented this design in 1836. These guns had interchangeable parts, but they were also very nice looking because of the engravings on them. And one of the things that was constantly being said about Samuel Colt's booth was just how artfully the guns were displayed, as you could see in this arrangement. And this is an actual picture of a Samuel Colt gun that was on display in the Crystal Palace. But probably one of the most important things that was demonstrated at this World's Fair to us as New Yorkers and to New York for posterity was Samuel Otis's emergency brake elevator. So elevator technology was a thing. There were steam-powered elevators at the time, but none of them had what Otis was demonstrating. And this is a picture of Otis demonstrating it himself in the center of the Crystal Palace. In case the hoisting ropes break, there would be a brake that you could apply to stop the elevator from plummeting down and most likely very badly injuring or killing the people who are in it. This brake technology will allow elevators to become extremely commonplace and, of course, for us to be able to build tall, which, again, building tall really starts here at the palace itself. And of course, he can demonstrate it because he has the height to do so in the center of the dome of the Crystal Palace. But of course, one of the things that really drew a lot of attention by the general public were the sculptures and the art that was brought to the fair at the time. And again, so says Horace Greeley, quote, "Sculpture brings before us form without color, a thing unknown to nature. It deals only with outlines and surfaces, having abstracted therefrom the mass of qualities that the common eye beholds in external objects. Consequently, the common eye is unable to judge of its excellence. But what happens is once you become an appreciator of sculpture, so says Greeley, it severely corrects taste among our countrymen." So again, the idea is once you start loving art, you become almost like art yourself a little bit. I might be leaning into that a bit, but that's what I think. But here is the sculpture that was hated the most. It is amazing, the ire that this sculpture drew from people. And it was done by an Italian expatriate French sculptor, Carlo Maracati. And it was so hated by everybody that the Tribune said, "It is bad. It is beneath mediocrity. It is a colossal abortion, a bag of meal on horseback." Maracati actually used the same horse that he used for Richard the Lionheart in the London exhibition, knocked Richard the Lionheart off, and made a sculpture of George Washington on top of it. It was moved after this season off to the side. It was taken out of the center and moved off to the side. People hated it. The Times said, "No one is sorry that it was moved. An impossible horse, best ridden by an impassive clod, was not an agreeable object." Again, people just hated this thing. Most likely because, I guess it looks okay to us maybe, but I think it was the way it made George Washington look slightly undignified. He's leaning back, that he's not upright. The horse itself is just weird. The proportions are a little odd, and people just absolutely hated it. You don't mess with Washington, especially to Americans. One of the most controversial, but then the most loved sculptures was this. It was by this was an American expat living in England. His name was Hiram Powers, and he made 5 life-size replicas of this called the Greek Slave. And it was very, very controversial at first. And as a matter of fact, when they unpacked it, people were quite scandalized when it was revealed that this was a fully nude woman. But Hiram actually put out pamphlets that came with each of these statues across the world that said, no, the nudity is totally fine because she is covering herself up in modesty. She has a very Christian nature to her because she's actually being depicted kidnapped, I believe by Ottoman Turks, to go into a harem for an Ottoman king. And of course, the idea is that she is going to keep her Christian dignity as much as she can, even though she's in shackles and will probably be sold pretty much as a sex slave. But it was considered to be perfectly fine for her to be naked. Otherwise, it would have been considered almost like pornography. But also very popular, of course, because of the controversy. Now you're going to see that statue, and it's in very many images of the Crystal Palace. And that is the depiction, the other equestrian statue, but this is an equestrian statue in action. And this was done by Auguste Louis Marie Autain, who was a French sculptor. And it's an Indian, which you don't really see at first how that is an Indian or a Native American, shooting an arrow at the throat of a snake. And the snake is coiling itself up the horse. And it was very popular, I think, because of the kinetic nature of it. And no matter where you looked in the palace, you could see it. But if you look closely behind or in the fore, the statue, you're going to see, my favorite, a lens for the Cape Hatteras lighthouse, because of course lighthouse is very important technology in the 1850s, especially the lenses. Chapter 5, A Perch in the Sky. So we talked a little bit, or a lot of it, about the World's Fair and the Crystal Palace, but the other main event, which shared a lot of the spotlight during the World's Fair and afterwards, was the Latting Observatory. And the Latting Observatory, again, as I mentioned, was built by he was described as a huckster, but he was also an inventor. He was quite a shrewd businessman, Warren Latting. And it was a completely private enterprise. He put money into it. He got investors to put money into it, but again, had nothing to do formally with the fair. He was just capitalizing on the fair going on. And of course, this will be the beginning of so many things in New York and in World's Fairs to come, mainly building very tall. And also every World's Fair had some kind of perch-like structure after Latting builds his observatory. So you could see here, this is actually advertising the saloon, but the observatory was an octagonal tower. It was made of wood. It was 75 feet, roughly in diameter. It had a basement, but it also had a base building, which was much longer. It was 350 feet, but actually, I believe it was 375 feet if you included the flagpole. And that was the only taller building in New York was Trinity Church. Remember, the Brooklyn Bridge is not built yet. That will become the next tallest structure, but this will be long gone. And the only thing taller was the Great Pyramid of Giza at the time, and a couple of cathedrals in Europe. Now, it was designed so that they originally had built a shaft for elevators, for a steam elevator, but because of budget, that never went in. So you had to climb your way up that thing. But Warren Latting said that's probably going to be a real tough thing for everybody to do in one spot or in one hike. So there were levels as you went up with different places to stop, take a breath. As a matter of fact, on the second floor, there was that ice cream saloon and rest stop where you could buy a drink, you could get an ice cream, you could look up from where you were and then take a breath and continue up to the top. One of the things that you could buy at this ice cream shop was a Crystal Palace glass bottle. And that thing's really pretty. And that's actually, this piece is up in the Corning Glass Museum. Carbonated soda became a big thing. They were selling healthy mineral water in it, but at some of the grog shops, because they knew there were going to be a lot of kids coming, there was a brand new invention called root beer that was being sold. And this was a wood graving made from the top view. Stanley, if you are on the talk, which I believe you are, I know you emailed this to me this morning. This is an iconic view from the top of the world at the time, where you could see Staten Island, Brooklyn. If you turned around, you could see Jersey, Westchester. Some would say up to 60 miles on a very clear day. And of course, for people, this would be the highest they had ever been in their lives. And you could just imagine what that view would feel like. Chapter 6, I know it's 1 o'clock. We have about 10-ish minutes left, because now we'll talk about the sad demise of these buildings. Conflagration. We don't call it fires. We call it conflagration. Very big at the time. And of course, the first building to go, unfortunately, is the Latting Observatory. And the Latting Observatory was burned to the ground a couple of years before the Crystal Palace. It's August of 1856. A fire breaks out in an old building Northeast of the area on 6th Avenue and about 43rd Street, it was probably a Cooper's shop. And there was also a storeroom for the 6th Avenue Railroad Company, which most likely had grease in it. It was not a good scene. And it spread very quickly to the observatory, which, as somebody wrote, went up like a torch, a monument, quote, a monument of flame reaching to the clouds amid darkness and smoke. Now, of course, there were pieces of the observatory falling near and almost onto the Crystal Palace. Many people were concerned it would take out the Crystal Palace. A lot of people were concerned it was going to fall over almost in its entirety onto the palace, and that would have destroyed it. But the palace was spared. Here's a article from the Times that day: a conflagration, destruction of the Latting Observatory, $150,000 worth of property destroyed, narrow escape of the Crystal Palace. And a very timesy description of what happened that evening. Now, the Crystal Palace, there's a whole bunch of history that we could talk about for the Crystal Palace after 1853 and that initial World's Fair season, but it would take another talk to get through it. P.T. Barnum will become the president after Thomas Sedgwick was thrown out for political reasons. The Crystal Palace will sit fallow for many years on 6th Avenue. Nobody knows what to do with it. The mayor at the time, or actually there's a new mayor at the time, will want to get rid of it. His name is Daniel F. Timon. He wants nothing to do with it. The exhibition company wants the city to buy it. There was an idea to even turn it into a railroad depot, but nobody seems to know what to do with it. Nobody wants it. And the year that it is destroyed, which is 1858, the summer of 1858, it is rigged 4 times over for gas, to run gas lighting so that they could do a soiree, a fundraising soiree at night there. I think this, and again, it's never proven why it burns down, but I think this is a big reason probably why there is the fire. But what you're seeing here is the last big event held at the Crystal Palace, which is September 1st, 1858. And it's a big celebration for the transatlantic telegraph cable being completed. Over 15,000 people will celebrate the completion of sort of the connection between Europe and America, taking only minutes and not days now through the telegraph, which was put on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. So they had set up a huge supper room, which also needed gas rigging. And it was a big event, and it looked like maybe the Crystal Palace would survive. Now, less than a month later, beginning of April, big problem. So the American Institute, which was a smaller version of the International Exhibition, New York-based, was holding their exhibition in the Crystal Palace at the time. It's later in the afternoon on October 5th of 1858, and they're going to fire up the gas for nighttime. So there's a really great book, which Nicole is going to put a link to right when I'm finished. Really awesome, very good, quick, condensed read by Edwin G. Burroughs, who also was co-author of Gotham, and which is one of my greatest sources for a lot of other stuff that I do. And he says that basically around 5 o'clock, they heard somebody say in the North Nave, turning the gas on. They turned the gas on, and about 2 minutes later, somebody said fire. And what they think may have happened was one of two things. Either somebody may have sabotaged a gas line to make it leak, or the gas lines were made of something called gutta percha, which was sort of like latex, not really good for gas lines, which leaked, and then obviously something immediately caught on fire, and within a half an hour, the building was gone. And Courier and Ives did quite a few representations of this burning. But, and you can see, I believe 3,000 people came out at one point to watch this happen from all around as they tried to wrestle this fire down. It did not work. Burroughs describes it really well, so I'm going to read it to you rather than try to do it myself. He does it very succinctly, and it really is very visceral. He says, the several hundred cast iron columns would begin to soften in the intense heat, lose structural integrity, spring away from the wrought iron girders that they were attached to. a possible reason for the odd sounds reported by some witnesses of the blaze. Unsupported, the galleries and their exhibits would then collapse onto the floor below, splintering joists and adding fuel to the fire. Only minutes would elapse before the iron panels and frames of the facade would begin to buckle, and the glowing conflagration consumed the wooden sashes that held the windows. A shower of broken melted glass would then have fallen on anyone who was still in the building. There was no one, as we know. After the Great Dome itself fell with a loud crash shortly after, the comparative silence must have seemed eerie. Nobody was reported injured or killed, which is really quite extraordinary. And here is a depiction of the remains, of course, in a very New York style. They sold remains. There was a woman by the name of Mrs. Richardson who put out an ad when the exhibition moved back down to Castle Garden that you can buy remnants of the Crystal Palace from her, the finest building ever built. And again, here's the day after, looking at the remains. And they even made commemorative coins that they sold at the time. The burning of the Great Crystal Palace, destroyed by fire. They say 40 minutes, but most people think it happened roughly in about a half an hour. But I'm sure it was still smoldering for a very long time. And there it is. I believe these coins are also from the Museum of the City of New York. Now, strangely enough, in 1936, the British Crystal Palace will also succumb to the same fate. A fire will break out in an office that will quickly spread throughout the entire structure, which will burn to the ground almost as quickly, even though I think it was 89 fire engines and hundreds of firefighters came to try to fight it. They could not. And lastly, the legacy. So what is the enduring legacy of the Crystal Palace and the Latting Observatory and this World's Fair? Well, there's a piece of glass from the Crystal Palace, which was sold as a remnant, which is now in the city, the Museum of the City of New York. It's gorgeous glass. Afterwards, they will clear the spot off, and a man by the name of William Cullen Bryant, who considered himself to be a student of Olmsted, would push for a park. And of course, that park will bear his name. Now, Bryant Park has a much deeper history than that, but we will save that for another day. But probably one of the most enduring legacies from the observatory was Gustav Eiffel. He went to the observatory, he climbed to the top of it, and he thought, well, this is a good idea, and I'm going to blow it out of the water. And of course he does. He was directly inspired by Latting's observatory. And for the Paris Expo of 1880, he will build his tower. And of course, there it is. Leaps and bounds more graceful. I believe it was described as having a surpassing grace of the Latting Observatory. Got to throw in Penn. Of course, a lot of Beaux-Arts artists who are creating, architects who are creating public space will go on to use something like the Crystal Palace structure to create temples for the public. And this is the concourse of Penn, the old Penn Station. And I found this, and this wasn't even something that came across my mind until I saw it, but from fair to fair, 1853 to 1939, the idea of the Trilon and Perisphere, some feel was directly influenced by the Latting Observatory and the dome of the Crystal Palace. So much so that there was a Crystal Palace exhibition in the amusement zone of the 1939 World's Fair. And there's George Washington in front of the Perisphere. And there's the Crystal Palace over in the amusement zone. It was like a bar at a dance hall. They did some shows there. Not to the same specifications, of course. A much smaller version. But other things that can draw some influence to it. What the botanical gardens, the New York Botanical Gardens in the Bronx. Of course, greenhouses have a very Crystal Palace look to them. And I say the Jacob Javits Center. Lastly, I will leave you with, again, because I'm big on the quotes for this presentation, but Walt Whitman had a season pass to the 1853 exhibition. He will publish Leaves of Grass 2 years later, about a year and a half later. He was highly influenced by the exhibition and the Crystal Palace. And this is a portion of his poem, Song of the Exhibition, which Nicole will also put a link to this poem in the chat. Around a palace, loftier, fair, ampler than any yet, Earth's modern wonder, history's 7 outstripping, high-rising tier with glass and iron facades, gladdening the sun and sky in hued and cheerful hues, bronze, lilac, robin's egg, marine, and crimson, over whose golden roof shall flaunt beneath the banner freedom. The banners of the states, the flags of every land, a brood of lofty fair, but lesser palaces shall cluster. I always think Walt Whitman was sort of a mystic. He really just looked into history and knew what was happening in the future of New York. And he knew that the future of New York hinged on this building and what it stood for. So there's Horace Greeley, who I passed by during many tours when we started City Hall Park. That's right outside of City Hall. He sits over us. I always sort of give him a nod when I walk by. He would go on to have a very robust political career. He was a congressman from New York. He also ran for president for the Liberal Republican Party. He lost. He lost against Ulysses S. Grant, so that's a guy to lose to. And he died in 1872, and he's buried in Greenwood Cemetery. But a lot of his ideals really go on to influence the New York we know today, including that ideal that New York was a melting pot, and we really need New York to be for all New Yorkers. And my last slide will end with a very great quote from the Herald, who said, after the burning of the Crystal Palace, New York doesn't need a Crystal Palace. We have, quote, here we have in Broadway at least 2 miles of palaces. Within that magic area, the efforts of the best artists and the cleverest mechanics may be found on view every day in the year without money and without price. If a man paints a good picture or invents a new flytrap or has anything curious to show or to sell, he puts it in a Broadway bazaar for an exhibition to a public that is always ready to look. If the ladies wish to see the latest importation from Europe, they are in splendid palaces like Stewart's, and he means A.T. Stewart's department store, while on every side rise edifices nearly as fine as his and crowded with the choicest products of the world's industry. And really, the last note I'll make is the Crystal Palace really was all of New York in one spot, and when we lose it, all of New York really becomes what the Crystal Palace meant to symbolize, as we built tall and we built glass in the future. So thank you very much for joining me. Please put any questions that you have in the question bar or chat, and I am going to ask Nicole to come back. I'm going to take a drink of water.
Yes, so I was keeping an eye on the chat as we went, and I caught a couple questions that came through. The first one is from Peter Tannen. He says it's about the London Crystal Palace.
Yes.
I assume that when it was moved, it was taken apart and reassembled. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was taken apart piece by piece and reassembled.
Awesome. And then we have another question from Mel Wasserman, referring to the map that you showed early on.
Yes.
Why did the map show the East River, Ward's Island, and Randall's Island in the Hudson River?
Oh, that was a cutaway. It was
Okay.
a cutaway to the other side because that map didn't have room to show the East River.
Cool. And then we have questions in the question
Awesome.
column. Peter Tanning, we got his. Margot, you mentioned silver medals, Singer and Colt. Were there gold medals? Do you know who won any of those?
No. And actually what I neglected to say, it was silver and bronze. There were no gold medals. It wasn't like the Olympics. Silver was the top. And then there was an overall silver medal for the entire fair. And that was for the best invention or best product displayed. And that silver medal was given to Carstensen and Gilden. I'm forgetting his name right now. I'm blanking. Sorry, my mind shut down. To the 2 architects because that was the only recognition that they got. but it was the highest recognition for the building itself. So the building gave itself the highest award, which was still a silver medal. It was the overall silver medal. So no gold.
Awesome. Okay. Matthew Kingsley wants to know if there is a copy of the 1853 Stranger's Handbook available online.
Yes. And I can, who wanted to know? I'm sorry.
Matthew Kingsley.
Oh, Matthew. Yeah, I'll find you the link and send it. I don't have it readily available. I think I got it through Goodreads. So I'll send a link later on. And if anybody else is interested, just email me, justin@untappedcities.com.
Cool. A couple more from Matthew. Also about the map. What was the name of the 1853 map?
The 1853 map was the map of 1853 by, let me see if I can go back to my, there were actually quite a few maps for 1853 because of the fair that were made of the city. And as you can see, that one already had marked out where the fairground was and where the reservoir was. I'm forgetting who was the one who what cartographer made the map, but let me go back and see if we can find it. If not, I'll look in my source notes.
Cool. And then the last question we have from Matthew, how are you marking the beginning of the tourism industry in NYC because of the Crystal Palace, which I believe is what you did?
Yes. So the Crystal Palace really created the fad of New York tourism. Before the Crystal Palace and the World's Fair, people did not come to New York for New York. They came to New York either to do business because we were a port city, or to travel. Mainly, actually, a lot of people were coming to New York to go up to Niagara Falls. So we did not have a lot of what we would call tourists coming to enjoy the city. And because of the Crystal Palace being such a spectacle, and because of the World's Fair, people are coming and staying. So all of these things I showed you, which were from The Stranger's Guide to New York, were mainly enjoyed by New Yorkers, Brooklynites, and people from New Jersey and Long Island who came into the city. What we might call today is bridge and tunnel, maybe, but they were just ferry back then. So, this was now a wider audience, which begins, you've got those like Times Square area junk shops with the I Heart New York shot glasses. Well, they basically had the version of Crystal Palace shot glasses. They had napkins, they had tea towels that you could take home with the Crystal Palace and New York buildings on it. This really starts modern tourism.
Awesome. And then we have a bunch of people suggesting future Lost New York topics in the chat. We do have coming up in May, Justin will be talking about the Lost Madison Square Gardens of New York City, which I dropped the link to in the chat for tickets, and also the Lost Mansions of Fifth Avenue later on. Mel suggests doing the Lost Post Office in City Hall Park. I think.
Yes, that's a good one.
Someone else said Madison Square Gardens earlier. So yeah, we definitely hope to see you guys on those next installments of this series. Yes,
Madison Square Garden is in process. That's next, and then the Gilded Age Mansions. That one's going to be crazy. These buildings were off the chain. Matthew, I'm going to also owe you the map because I have the larger version of the map in my files that got cut down. And I will give you the designation for that as well.
Oh, sorry. There was one more question.
Yes.
A little off topic, but Alex noticed that some items had New York with the hyphen in the middle of it written. When did New York City lose the hyphen?
New York City lost the hyphen, I believe. Now, this is a topic I believe we've written about on Untapped, if I remember. And actually, I'm going to see if I can find.
I have actually written about it.
You have?
So it's mentioned. I talk about it in the New York Historical Society secrets, which I'll drop the link to in there.
I believe we officially use it in the early 20th century because there are monuments from the 1920s that still have the hyphen between New and New York. It's almost like the G in Williamsburg. I am not exactly sure why that happens or what it is that sort of moves away from the hyphen in New York, because it was obviously extremely popular to hyphenate New York in the height of the 19th century.
Right.
But yeah, I believe, so I'm thinking of actually the 1926 flagpole monument that the Dutch gave us, that's featured on the Dutch New Amsterdam tour, and that's from 1926, and it has New hyphen York on it. If anybody has any knowledge about that, please let me know.
Seth, a question just popped in from Seth. You used a map as a background for the Chapter 2 title card. I would love to see that map.
Yeah, so that is a different map. I also have that in my Sorts Notes file. So who is it who'd like to see it?
Seth.
Okay.
Lubin.
Oh, Seth. Yes. All right, Seth. I think I have your email. I will also email you with that file, so you can take a look at it.
All right. I think those are all the questions that I saw. Just a note about some more upcoming events. Tomorrow, Justin's back with Untapped New York's founder, Michelle Young, to talk about the second episode of the Secrets of New York podcast, which is about manhole covers. That is an insiders only event. If you are having trouble registering, just send us an email to insiders@untappedcities.com. We're still working out some things on our new website. We also have the Art of Grand Central, which Justin is also hosting on March 3rd. And then the week after, we have Carole King's New York City with the author Lauren Glass, who has a new book about Problem Tapestry coming out.
Lovely. I hope you guys aren't tired of me. I'll be back. But no, these are a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed this one. This talk was very much a labor of love. I see Gareth suggested a talk on Oscar Hammerstein. That would be great. I'd love to do that. The Hammerstein family was a big New York family. Very interesting. And I think, Gareth, you also corrected my pronunciation. Sydenham or Sydenham, which is good because I didn't, although I'm an Anglophile, there are some names I still, Sydenham. Okay, Sydenham. Good, thank you. Always good to know. Glad that you all, thank you, Pete. Glad that you all joined me today. Hope you enjoyed. You will be getting a recording of this from Livestorm very quickly, but Insiders, we will also be putting a recording in the archives as well. And I would like everybody to have a really good day. For those of you that I have homework for, I will, yes, and long A. You know what, Michael? I knew immediately after I said it that I was wrong. I was like, it's a long A in Copenhagen, not Hagen. Lord. But thank you for joining me anyway. Mispronunciations and all. Have a good day, guys. Please stay safe. And we will see you maybe even tomorrow. Have a good one. Bye.